verse from Genesis 1:28. This is prior to Adam and Eve sinning, and it gives you an indication, a very big indication of God's plan for mankind. And we read this: God blessed them. And that was God's plan, a blessing on human beings. And then he says to them, he says, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So this is what God wanted for humanity. He created the world, plants and fish and animals, and trees and all that. And then the pinnacle of his creation was mankind. And once he'd done that, he said to mankind, well, first of all, he blessed them. A blessing rested on his creation. And then he says to them, he says, be fruitful, increase in number. Fill the earth. And then notice this, he says, subdue it. The earth and everything in it was to be subject to human beings. That was God's original plan. We were to be masters of this earth. We were to subdue the earth. We were to make sure everything obeyed us. It answered to us. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living creature. And that was God's plan. You will rule. You will rule over this earth. Everything in it is yours. You will rule over it. It will be subject to you. These days, you try going up to a lion and saying, you're subject to me. I think the lion might have another idea. You go to the sea and you say to a shark, you're subject to me. And he says, no, you're my dinner. You see, the world has gone wonky. It's no longer the way God intended it to be. The earth was created for us to rule over, to use to help one another. It was to procreate, to inhabit the earth, and to use all the resources and everything in it for the common good. And that was God's plan. That's what God originally wanted. And of course, it is not that way. But does that mean that the plan that God had is now void? No, because we come now to the book of Hebrews. And we come to chapter 2, verses 5 to 9, I think. And notice this. There is a world to come. And the writer to the Hebrews says there is a world to come. There is a new world to come. We read in other places that the Lord says there will be a new heaven and a new earth. And the writer to the Hebrews says this: it is not to angels that he is subjected to the world to come. In chapter 1 of Hebrews, the writer has gone out of his way to prove that Jesus is vastly superior to angels. There is no comparison between the two. And he goes through the whole procedure of lots of Bible verses. And that's why angels are mentioned at the beginning of this section here, because he's continuing a theme. But he says it's not to the angels that I've been talking about which we are speaking. It's not to them he has subjected the world to come. But there is a place where someone has testified, and someone who's testified is the psalmist, and this comes from Psalm 8. And he quotes this: what is man that you are mindful of him? The psalmist is speaking to God. What is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. And then he goes on to say, what is man? Man is special. You made man a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor, and you put everything under his feet. And that goes back to what's said in Genesis. Man ruled. And here the psalmist, and the psalmist being quoted by the writer to the Hebrews, says, you made man a little lower than the angels, you crowned him with glory and honor, and you put everything under his feet. In putting everything under him, God left nothing that is not subject to him. So everything was subject to mankind. Some people have looked at this passage in Hebrews and they think because you get this phrase, the Son of Man, that this is talking about Jesus. If you go back to Psalm 8, it is very clearly talking about mankind. It's talking about us. And if you follow the logic through here, what the writer is saying is that the world to come will be subjected to mankind. In the future, man will have the same status that he was originally intended to have before Adam and Eve sinned. We will get back to that point where this world is subject to us, because that's the way God wanted it to be. That was his plan for mankind, to rule over this earth, its resources, its creatures, its vegetation, its plants, everything. Not in the sense of sort of a domination, but in the sense of being subject to us, but obviously carefully looking after, making sure everything is looked after and used for the common good. And that was God's plan. And the writer here says that the world to come will be again subject to mankind. It will come back to the way it was supposed to be. And this is very interesting because it's so very easy to think that mankind is sort of, well, not that good really. But that's not the way he was created, and that's not the way the psalmist, and it's not the way the writer of the Hebrews views mankind. What is man that you're mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care about. But you made him just a little lower than the angels. Now, it's very interesting to note that if you go back to Psalm 8, which this is quoted from, the word that is translated angels here in the psalm is actually the word Elohim, which is the word for God. Now, you can get into an interesting discussion as to what that really means. I don't know all the ins and outs of it. I'm just stating that in that psalm, which most translations have got as angels, is probably incorrect. Because in every other place where the word Elohim is translated, on the whole, it says God. And so you can have this sort of discussion that actually mankind has been created a little lower than God. And if you see what comes next and the way the writer pursues this, you begin to sort of see where he's coming from, what the psalmist was perhaps getting at. But you see, the thing is that mankind was crowned with glory and honor. We had glory, we had honor. Everything was under our feet. That was our state. What a glorious state it was when God created us, right in the beginning of time. And we ruled over this world. And then we messed up. But the writer here says that the world to come, we will rule again. But the interesting question is, well, what about the meantime? And notice this at the bottom, in putting everything under him, God left nothing that is not subject to him. That was why it was created. We come into the next section. And we can agree with this because we only have to look around us. And I quoted the lion and the shark, but you can think of many other examples. They are not subject to us unless you've got a chair and a whip or whatever. Or a cage for a shark, encased in it yourself. Yet at present we do not see everything subject to him. But then the writer of the Hebrews goes off And he says, but we do see Jesus. And Jesus is the whole subject matter, really, of Hebrews. It's the whole point of Hebrews, and it's the whole point of the relevance of Jesus to us. And here's talking about human beings, mankind ruling the earth. And it says at the moment we don't see everything subject to us. But who do we see? Well, we see Jesus. And we look at that from a historical point of view. 2,000 years ago, Jesus walked the earth. And he was made a little lower than the angels. He was made in the same state as we are. He was made a little lower than the angels. It says that mankind was made a little lower than the angels. Well, here it says Jesus was made a little lower than the angels. But because the writer of the Hebrews is looking back in time, he knows that Jesus died, rose again, and ascended. And here he says, Jesus was made a little lower than the angels, but now, Jesus' glorious state now is crowned with glory and honor. Jesus has glory and honor. How did he get that? Because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. See, Jesus now has glory and honor, but he suffered. He suffered while he was here. What did he suffer? Well, he suffered death. He was killed. He rose again. He ascended. But this verse here, right at the very end, it says that by the grace of God, Jesus has tasted death for everyone. You see, by Jesus' death, by Jesus going through what he did, he tastes death for us. And we come back to this thought a bit later. But he suffered death, basically, so that we wouldn't suffer death. He suffered for us. Now we come into the next section of Hebrews. And it continues to talk about Jesus. Jesus made a little lower than angels, but he died, he rose again, and he ascended. Now notice this. In bringing many sons to glory, we have been brought to glory through what Jesus did. Do you feel glorious this morning? Do you have that glory? Do you exude that glory? Because it is very clear that Jesus has brought many sons to glory. It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. Both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers. In the presence of the congregation I will sing your praises. And again I will put my trust in him. And again he says, here am I, and the children God has given me. But what do we learn from this particular section? Well, we learn that Jesus is the author of our salvation. He is the one who instigated our salvation. He has suffered. He has suffered as a man. He understands what we go through. He knows what touches human beings, what affects human beings, because it touched him and it affected him. But notice this, both the one who makes men holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. Jesus is holy. He is the one who makes men holy. And those who are made holy are of the same family. Now, what is this telling us? This is telling us that Jesus is holy and we are holy. Have you got that? Jesus is holy and we are holy. because that's what that verse says. One makes men holy, Jesus, and those who are made holy are us. The King James version of this has this. You've got the King James version of verse 11, I think it is. And remember, some time ago I spoke about sanctification. How Paul writes in Thessalonians that I pray that God may sanctify you through and through. That God may sanctify you through and through. He that sanctifies is Jesus, and they who are sanctified are all one. Jesus is sanctified, he is holy. But we are holy, and we are sanctified, and we are one. It's very easy to lose the impact of that. Jesus is holy, and we are holy. Therefore, we're the same as Jesus. Jesus was holy by nature. He was holy. We are holy because of what Jesus did. So the holiness is achieved by two different routes. Jesus has it one way, and we have it another way. But the thing to remember is it doesn't matter how you got it. You have it. Jesus is holy. We are holy. The same state. The same holiness Jesus has, we have. That is powerful. Incredibly powerful to understand. Many of us look at ourselves and we think, well, yeah, right. There's Jesus and there's me, and there's a world of difference. No, there isn't. That's the amazing thing to note. You see, where are we holy? We're holy in our spirit. We are a new creation, Paul says. We are born again, Jesus says. And in our spirit, the very spirit we have and the very spirit Jesus has are exactly the same thing. There is no difference whatsoever. That is why the writer to the Hebrews can say, he is sanctified and I am sanctified and you are sanctified. He is holy, we are holy. Exactly the same state. Arrived at by different means, but we have exactly the same state as Jesus. Oh, that we could get our heads around that and realize who we are. We go back to that passage, please, Julie. That's the one. Notice that. We're of the same family. And because we're of the same family, the writer goes on to say, so Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers and sisters. We are Jesus' brothers and sisters. Isn't that awesome? He's your brother. You know, if we think of it in the worldly sense, you know, what is a brother and a sister? Well, it means you have the same parentage. It means that you're peers. You have the same rights. You have the same responsibilities. You have the same privileges as one another. Because we're all of one family. Whatever rights Jesus has, and whatever responsibilities he has, whatever authority he has, whatever blessings are his, as the child of his Father, we have. Because we're all brothers and sisters. It's been achieved by a different route because Jesus is the Son of God. By whatever you want to say, by DNA, by divine, he is the Son of God. But Paul in Romans says that we've been adopted into the family. But you see, the end result is the same. We are all brothers and sisters with the same parents, the same Father. So whatever Jesus has access to, whatever privileges, whatever blessings as being a child of God, the Father, we have. Exactly the same. There is no difference, you see. Jesus is our brother and sister, and there's no difference between him and us in the sense of brothers and sisters of the same family. In fact, the writer is very clear. We are all of the same family. But the thing is, do we understand that? Do we get it? Are we really aware of the fact that Jesus is our brother? That we are now in the same family? We have the same rights, the same responsibilities, the same authority, the same blessings, same privileges as Jesus. There is no difference. Whatever Jesus is entitled to, we are. Because we're all of the same family. We're all the same state. He's holy, we're holy. But we don't see that. We don't really get it. But this is what the word says. We go on to the next section of Hebrews, please, Julie. 14, 15, I think it is. Since the children have flesh and blood, Jesus too took on flesh and blood. He shared our humanity. And he shared it so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Basically, this can be summed up in the statement, Jesus has destroyed death. And he's destroyed the power of the one who had death. Satan has the power of death. It's interesting to note that that resides with the devil. It doesn't reside with God. Satan is the one who has the power of death. Or, more accurately to say for us as Christians, had the power of death. Because Jesus has now dealt with that problem. He has destroyed him who holds that power. The death no longer has the power of death over Christians. And don't forget, death isn't just the cessation of life, ceasing to, be. When God said to Adam, don't eat of that tree, he said, the day you eat of the fruit of that tree, you will die. Well, they ate of the fruit and they didn't die straight away. Many years later, they did physically die. But God was talking about a far more extensive death. Not just a physical death, but a spiritual death. But according to this, you see, Jesus has now taken that back. Whatever encompasses death, Jesus has now usurped the power of the enemy and has claimed that back. And has claimed it back so that we who were held in slavery by the fear of death may no longer have that fear. And if you look at this passage, what are the two problems really, and they're sort of entangled one with another, that humanity has, that mankind has. There are two problems, sin and death. And the writer to Romans, Paul, says that the wages of sin is death, so they're entangled together. One results in the other. But this passage conclusively says Jesus has dealt with the death issue. And we know from numerous other scriptures that Jesus has dealt with the sin issue. Now the thing is, if Jesus has dealt with the two issues that affect mankind, what's left? What else is there left to get at us? Surely nothing. Because the very problems that mankind brought on themselves, sin and death, have all been dealt with. Now, I can't go into, mainly because I haven't looked at it, but I just think the repercussions of that must be immense. Because the very things that hinder humanity that have been the consequence of man's downfall, sin and death, have all been dealt with by Jesus. And the question is, do we realize that? Do we get it? Do we understand what Jesus has done? This passage talks about the fact that Jesus is holy and we are holy. Do we get that? Do we get the fact that Jesus is our brother? We are brothers and sisters of Jesus. And all that that means. All that that entitles us to as being brothers and sisters of Jesus. There is no difference. We're now of the same family. You see, it's very easy, and I think this is a pitfall that we fall into as Christians, to see Jesus on one level and to see us a very long way down somewhere else. And that's not right. That's not scriptural. Because you only have to look at this passage to see Jesus is there, and where are we? There. Exactly the same level as Jesus. This is what this passage says. You can't, well, you might in your mind think, well, that's not true, but this passage says, well, it is true. And I think there are lots of other passages that talk about the same thing. Just finish with this. Jesus, I remember doing this around Easter, probably a few years ago, but Jesus made this statement before he died. About 2 days, I think 3 days before he died. And he said this, he said, unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, it cannot bear much fruit. Unless a seed falls into the ground and dies, it cannot bear much fruit. Now, because of when Jesus said that, very, very close to his death, I believe he was talking about himself. And basically what he was saying was, unless I die, I cannot reproduce myself. I cannot reproduce myself in mankind, my nature in mankind. So he died and he rose again. But the result is that there are now many Jesuses in this world. You and me. We are Jesus in this world. And you don't have to go that far back to a sermon that Nick spoke, from, I think it's 1 John, where it's 1 John chapter 4, I think it is, where it says this, as Jesus is, so am I in this world. You see, if you take this passage, and it's all in there, it's nice compacted, and you look at it and you read it, and you think, well, what are the natural conclusions I can draw from this? That is where you come out. There is Jesus, and there am I. But we don't see that. Or we don't think that, or we don't believe that, or we don't know that. Well, the problem then is with us. Because if the word says that's what it is, then we have to adjust our thinking, our understanding, our knowledge, to get to a point where we recognize, hey, Jesus is there, and I'm on the same level as Jesus. That has some tremendous conclusions to it. What Jesus can do, I can do. Rights he has, I have. Blessings he has, I have. Responsibilities he has, I have. Life he has, I have. It's the only conclusion you can draw, but it's a real challenge. And the problem we have is that we look at ourselves and we look at our flesh and we look at our soul, our emotions and our mind, and we say, I'm nothing like Jesus. Stop looking at the flesh and stop looking at the soul and look at your spirit and think, in my spirit, I'm exactly the same as Jesus. And the thing that we have to learn is to, I think, draw from our spirit what is really there and make that active within the rest of us. Draw out from the spirit into our mind, into our emotions, into our personality, into our character, into our thinking. And also, I believe you can draw that out into your body. Because Jesus is all about life. Satan had the power of death, but Jesus is all about life. And God's all about life. I think that's a fascinating chapter. And I think actually it is quite clear in what it says. But the problem is we don't get what it's saying, really get it, really understand it, really think, oh yeah, that's true. I don't yet. But I think what it's trying to draw out, what it's trying to say is incredibly powerful. And if we only thought that way, I think our lives would change. We tend to have a down on ourselves as humanity, as mankind, and we think, I've heard it said, we're worms, we're like slugs on the ground, we're awful, we're dreadful, we're horrible, we're nasty little things, the messes we make and all that. That is not what the Bible says about those who believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. As a man thinks, he will behave. If you think you're Jesus, you'll behave like Jesus. And I can tell from the glazed expressions and the expressions that look at me. But I don't see how we can draw any different conclusions from this chapter of Hebrews as to what the writer is trying to impart to us. And it goes back, what is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him. And what is man? He's amazing. Yes, we fell, we made a mistake, we got it all wrong. But Jesus, by his love and grace, has brought us back to a position of glory. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, this passage talks about. And Romans 8, sort of about 3/4 of the way through, it will talk about those whom he has glorified. We've been glorified because of the work of Christ. I think we have to have a different view of ourselves. It's a challenge. Stop looking at the flesh and stop looking at your emotions, your mind and your character and your personality. Let's look at the Spirit. Born again. It's amazing. And yet, I think the truth is we just don't get it really. Amen.